Hello and welcome to the video lecture for Chapter 11. So in case you're not aware, this is new material. This will not be on Exam 2, which is this coming Thursday, April 23rd. This material will be on the third exam. So Chapter 11 covers basically two viewpoints on the macro economy. We've actually already seen one in the last lecture. We basically saw what's referred to as the classical model in the last lecture. So we're going to talk about the implications and key aspects of the classical model. And then we're also going to look at basically a newer model called the Keynesian model. And we're going to compare and contrast those two models. All right, so to kick us off for this chapter, we're going to think about the fact that Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States, and therefore its residents are subject to many United States laws. Now, when the U.S. minimum wage was raised in steps a few years ago, over a decade now at this point, the increase boosted the minimum wage above market clearing wages in some Puerto Rican labor markets. Now, what this caused was surplus labor in these markets, which basically led to higher unemployment. So in this chapter, we're going to be thinking about these kinds of issues. We're going to learn about how the U.S. minimum wage increase generated an aggregate supply shock across the Puerto Rican economy. So these are the kinds of things we're going to be thinking about in this chapter. So in the first section, our learning objective is to describe the short-run determination of equilibrium, real GDP, and the price level in the classical model. And to some degree, this will actually be a recap because we again, basically saw the classical model in the previous chapter. The learning objective for the second section is to be able to discuss the essential features of this other model called the Keynesian model and explain the short-run aggregate supply curve, which is something we haven't seen yet. In the third section, we're going to explain what factors cause shifts in the short-run and long-run aggregate supply curves. In section 4, we're going to evaluate the effects of aggregate demand and supply shocks on equilibrium real GDP in the short run. And in the last section, we're going to determine the causes of short-run variations in the inflation rate. So here's our outline for the chapter. First, we're going to look at the classical model. Then we're going to look at the Keynesian model. We're going to talk about shifts in aggregate supply curves. We're going to look at consequences of changes in aggregate demand. And we're going to wrap it all up by talking about short-run variations in inflation or price level. All right, so did you know that the price of a bottle containing 6.5 ounces of Coca-Cola remained unchanged at 5 cents from 1886 to 1959. That's crazy. It was the same price for over 70 years. Pretty insane. Did you know that prices of final goods and services have not always adjusted immediately in response to changes in aggregate demand? Right, so that's something we saw in the last chapter, right? We saw that when aggregate demand changes, it leads to a change in the price level. But those changes don't always happen immediately. Did you know that the classical model and the Keynesian approach help us in understanding variations in real GDP and the price level? Well, you probably didn't know that because that's what this chapter is about, right? Which is why you're here. You're here to learn that.